Hello, welcome back, everyone. We are reconvened for the policy session, but happily we have a professional moderator, so I'm just going to hand straight over to Stephanie Sung Johnson, who, as I'm sure you all know, is the chief correspondent for Tax Notes International, and arguably the leading journalist worldwide working on the OECD tax reform. So we're delighted to have Stephanie with us, and delighted that I'm not moderating. So Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alex. That's very kind of you to say. Well, I'm pleased and honored to moderate this afternoon's session, Which Way Now for Tax Reform and Redistribution of Global Taxing Rights. Thanks to Alex for inviting me. Thanks to the Tax Justice Network team for a great event so far. This is pretty cool, being part of a digital event, a truly digital event, to discuss, these topics. So just want to share with you. So yesterday I was working on a year-end piece, looking at the work that's done in 2019 on global tax reform through the OECD framework. And, it was due last Monday. Apologies to my editors. I'm sure my editor is actually watching right now, so I apologize. But in this case, my procrastination actually paid off, because in this past week alone, so much has happened in this space that has raised a lot of questions about where this tax reform effort is going in 2020. And as I reported developments over the past year, it seemed to be a lot of excitement about and hope about the OECD's work program, which was published in the end of May. We've all talked about it earlier in the earlier panel, because it seemed that the world was on the cusp of real change. It mentioned dipping a toe into concepts that no one else would have thought the OECD would ever consider. Formula apportionment, unitary taxation, a departure of the arm's length standard, and giving more taxing rights to market jurisdictions, as well as minimum corporate taxation. I believe David used the term heretical into describing these concepts at one point in time. But now, countries seem to be open to this, and it's been very exciting to watch. We've also seen the blocks of developing countries like the G24 starting to make their voices heard in the public sphere, in the public consultation process, and within the inclusive framework on BEPS. And OECD countries like France and Germany and even the United States were supportive of the work, and even business was on board. So things seem to be going well. But as with most political processes involving new ideas, negotiations appear to have hit some roadblocks, made worse by trade tensions over unilateral measures such as digital services taxes. And the OECD has said all the time that countries are still committed to negotiations. But where might we end up in 2020? We're sort of at the end of the year. Things are a little unsure. So here with me today to discuss these and other questions are my panelists, who I will introduce shortly. But first, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Mary Lou Uy, Director of the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Group of 24, who will now speak on the G24 proposal and the challenges of the inclusive framework. Mary Lou, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. So, and thanks very much for the invitation, Alex. I really appreciate being here, and it's quite fun to be in this is also my first virtual conference. So, let me start now and just go through the slides that we have shared. So here. If I do a little bit of context setting on who we are, because we're not a well-known intergovernmental grouping. So we're starting out. This is the outline. Do a little bit of background and where we have stood in the topic of domestic resource mobilization, and how we have participated in various international forums. And of course, the elements of our proposal and the challenges. And we'll go through them fairly speedily on who we are and the context setting. So let me start with the background on the G24. It's a long-standing intergovernmental grouping established in the 70s. And for a number of decades, we have pretty much expressed our views within the context of the Bretton Woods institutions. So we've been very active in the area of international financial architecture, for example. But more recently, perhaps because of the SDGs and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, we have been much more active in the area of development financing, particularly on taxation issues. So we're 28 members, not 24, and distributed across fairly evenly across 3 regions in the world. So we have the advantage of being fairly representational of the various regions. So let me now get to the next slide. Here, this is the evolution of the views we have espoused on the area of domestic resource mobilization. We have been very clear that it is an important part of the policy agenda of our members, both to raise revenues as well as to promote a more inclusive growth. But the domestic efforts ought to be supported by international tax cooperation. And here, over a number of years, since 2015, we have consistently sought in our communiques, and these are quotes from our communiques, by the way, the importance of encouraging much more, encouraging the reform of the international tax rules. So, the next slide also looks at the more recent, let's say, communique messages. And here, it's what we have here is really a strong support for the various international initiatives on the reform of the global tax rules. And we have encouraged developing countries to participate in the inclusive framework. So very strong support for that. In 2015, we invited Pascal to our technical group meeting, for example, as early as 2015, and to talk about the potential reforms and the prospects of the base erosion and profit shifting initiative. And then, and more recently, we have, of course, then become much more specific in our comments in relation to responding to the challenges of the taxation of the digital economy. Now, if one takes a look at it, we have not only been encouraging support for the initiatives of the OECD and the G20, but we have also been quite clear that local capacity of our countries, which are fairly variable across countries, is an important consideration in designing the international tax initiatives and international tax reforms, simply because implementability at the country level is of great importance to us because of the more limited capacities in a number of countries. So those are the key messages that we have had in our communiques. Now, the next slide shows that, I mean, we have 19 countries in the BEPS inclusive framework out of 28. And that's quite a big number in terms of participation. So there's a bit of awareness in the G24 about the initiatives being carried out under the BEPS agenda. We also have members in the UN Tax Committee, as well as on the automatic exchange of information and the Global Forum. So here, what we gain from this is the variety of perspectives that we then bring to bear when we express our views on what to do in the area of international tax reforms. So the next slide is, okay, now, for the first time in a number of years, the Group of 24 decided to form a working group on tax policies and international tax cooperation. And that was really driven by the strong interest of our members to work on increasing tax revenues. And it's not, as you can see, the working group's 6 priority areas of focus are not only around international tax cooperation, but also around peer learning in a number of areas where it really is in the domestic policy space. But of course, as part of a lot of a number of priority areas really are around international, the international tax agenda. So here, the second bullet point, which is the tax challenges from the digitalization of the economies, was a topic that was raised by the working group, not only because the topic was being the search for a multilateral solution was being done, but because it really has become a political issue in a number of our countries in terms of the sense of fairness or unfairness that these companies that are operating in our economies are actually not paying their share of taxes. So that's, and the working group was created in 2018, had ministerial endorsement, particularly in the areas of focus that they had articulated, and was then set to be able to help us or help our members craft some responses to the ongoing agenda of the OECD on the multilateral solution for taxing the digital economy. So the next one. Now, here is just a timeline. As you can see, our comments are really done in the public space. It's not, we don't do it through our individual countries in the inclusive framework, but as a group, we comment on the public space. Now, we have been appreciative. We have appreciated the consultative approach of the OECD, in the sense that in various parts of the deliberations, they would open it up for public consultation. And that has given us the opportunity to, as a group, to provide our comments. And of course, our comments are shared, are developed internally among our members, and it's not shared only within the working group, but shared across all member countries before we submit these comments to the OECD. And we've had 3 occasions early in January when the initial stage of thinking on the design of the 3 rules was being done, and we provided our inputs, and then in March again in the public consultation, and recently on the consultation on the unified approach in Pillar 1. Next. Now here, these are just some of the elements of the G24 proposal to address the taxation of the digital economy. Our first attempt was really to propose the concept of the significant economic presence as a basis for the Nexus rule. And there, I believe our voice was heard. We came in late in terms of proposing this when the 2 other proposals by the UK and the US were already firmly in place. But it got heard, and it was then the third option that was then released in March of this year. So I won't go through the whole thing, except to say that when the concept of the significant economic presence was broached in our comments, we did say that the interaction with the economy can have different proxies. It would come from revenues, user base, and associated data input, the volume of digital content, as well as support services to attract customers to the digital enterprise. So it's we did say that there are some factors that could be taken into account in defining the basis of judging the sustained economic presence of a company. So then the other element is on fractional apportionment, which is on the profit allocation rule. And here we did say that this is one way to give a balanced recognition to both supply and demand factors that contribute to profit allocation. And among those watching, there's quite a bit of knowledge into this, so I won't go through that. Now, what our other principle, which is related to this, is that whatever is the allocation method that is used needs to be flexible to accommodate countries' preferences and treaties. And I'm talking about some who follow the UN Model Tax Convention, and the others are the OECD model. So then the fourth item is a withholding tax on digital transactions, which is as a means of implementation. And our view is this needs serious consideration, and what, of course, this would mean in terms of rates and basis would need to have, let's say, more technical work. But it is important to consider the possibility of the withholding tax, and I believe the UN Tax Committee had this in their comments. Then lastly, of course, is our usual message, which is that it really is important to consider simplicity and rules and implementation mechanisms that can be effectively implemented in developing countries, which have various levels of administrative capacity. So these are the 5 elements and 5 principles of our main proposal that we presented early in the year. Now, the next, our most recent set of comments were, of course, around the unified approach. And here, the comments adhere to the principles laid out in the unified approach, which we do support, which we agree with. So the issue is how to come closer to how to implement these principles to make it work also for developing countries, and to make sure that one has an equitable outcome out of this process. So we have in the recent G20 deputies, we did express our support that this is a good first step, although there are certain areas that could be given further consideration, and where changes could be made. So that's now the comments we made were around the nexus, and particularly the revenue threshold for the application of the new rule, which has to consider the size of the economies, and we support that. But and we would like to make sure that the threshold level is kept sufficiently low so that the benefits for developing countries are also meaningful. Then the other important comment we had was on the scope, which not only builds a layer of complexity, but might also be unnecessarily excluding digital-based businesses that really ought to be taxed. Now, carve-outs, we also are open to that, in the sense that for some of our countries, resource-rich countries, their key concern really is what to do with extractive industries. And so the potential, one would rather deal with that in terms of a carve-out and dealing with them separately than trying to complicate the debate around the rule to accommodate the taxation of extractives. On the profit attribution and the fraction, we still maintain the importance of going with a fractional apportionment, and the key comment as well was on the treatment of the normal profit or the routine profit, where the unified approach does not allocate any of it to a jurisdiction where an enterprise has significant economic presence and no physical presence. So, and the third element of our comment was that it's really about potential impact, in the sense that preliminary indications do indicate that the net flow of additional revenue to developing countries under Amount A appears to be minimal, and such an outcome may not be satisfactory for all members of the inclusive framework, particularly if one is actually giving up a unilateral taxing right, and at the end of it losing from the new solution. So the last item was quite new, which is on dispute resolution. And there was quite a strong reaction against the emphasis on dispute resolution, which I understand is important for many countries because of the need for tax certainty. And so our proposal was to make sure that more emphasis should be given to greater simplicity and prevention of disputes at the outset. So that's the key sort of substantial messages that we have given in as comments to the inclusive framework. Now, let me look at the challenges in engaging. It has not been easy for us for many reasons. The first is the timeline, of course. The timeline is extremely short. to be able to have, kind of feel like one has the homework to take strong views. That is not to say that we do not appreciate the opportunity to engage with the inclusive framework. We do a lot, but the complexity of the proposals, naturally, I guess, by the nature of the topic, in face of a tight timeline, is really posing a challenge to our countries, particularly more so for the ones with more limited capacities. It actually is a good reason for us to get together and draw leverage on countries with more capacity than others to develop views on whether the proposed options will work for developing countries on an equitable basis. Now, then among our members, we have, as you can see, heterogeneous set of members. And so finding common ground is bound to be difficult and might lead to more nuanced negotiating positions. We have larger markets, smaller markets. We have resource-rich countries whose concerns are different. But at the end of the day, actually, it was not all that difficult to get members to agree that there are certain principles that could be expanded upon more in the OECD discussions that could address the concerns of developing countries. Now, the third part is the linking. The third issue is on linking participants in the BEPS inclusive framework with our G24 focal points, in the sense that we don't always have tax people in our meetings, for example, but the ministers are, of course, the policymaker in charge of the tax agencies. So this made the working group approach actually a very practical one, in the sense that the working group is able to bring in tax people to formulate a more technical view. And then fourth one is probably linked to the other items, which is the limited availability of information to assess the impact of the various options. This was the view I expressed recently in the G20 deputies last week, where we did say that it is imperative to have the means for much more information being made available to all countries on assessing the impact of the options. And here, international organizations such as the IMF, for example, have an important role to play in making this information available to all, and so do think tanks and academic, civil society and academic organizations. Now, finally, and this is probably at the heart of it, it's still a forum for international norm setting with universal membership remains elusive at this point. And the quote from the IMF is the best that I could do. And so let me borrow from the IMF on the importance of much more universal discussions, largely because of spillovers and distortions from uncoordinated policies. Now, that said, we also believe that we could build on the progress that we have made so far. And of course, the inclusive framework is one of the most important ones that is one of the forum that we could work with. And we hope, and our goal from the group is to be constructive and be able to provide a voice to developing countries and make sure that the discussions are inclusive and lead to more equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou, for those comments. Really insightful and very helpful for all of us to understand where G20 is coming from. So now I'd like to introduce my panelists to offer their perspectives on where the reforms might go in the immediate term. Let's start with starting with Ben Dickinson. He is the head of, sorry, I'm looking at. Sorry about that. He's the head of Global Relations and Development, Center for Tax Policy Administration for the OECD. I have Maren Verhoeven, head of Global Tax Team and lead economist at World Bank. I have Vicki Perry, Assistant Director and Division Chief of the Revenue Administration Division of the Fiscal Affairs Division at the IMF. I have Sol Picciotto, Coordinator of the BEPS Monitoring Group and Emeritus Professor at Lancaster University. So thank you so much for being here today. What I'll do is ask you all the same questions, have you, each of you give your views, and I'll ask some quick follow-up questions to all of you, including Mary Lou. And then we'll open the floor to the Q&A. And then I'll ask, and I'll also ask my own questions or some final thoughts. So now the first question is, where are the firms going in the immediate term, and what might the inclusive framework decide in January 2020? And what will this process deliver as a result? And will it be the last word? What next? Ben, let's start with you, and perhaps maybe you'd like to respond to what Mary Lou said in her presentation as well. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. I very much enjoyed what Mary Lou said, and I should give recognition to the proposal that the G24 put on the table, which has very strongly influenced how the Secretariat has taken a variety of different ideas and come up with the unified approach. And as Mary Lou said, this was based on ideas from the US, the UK, and the G24 themselves, which has ended up in the idea primarily of a reward to market jurisdiction, which is the essence of Pillar 1. Let me say a couple of things about things that I think are important in terms of quite radical departures from the past, which I think now that they're on the table, they are going to be very difficult to dismiss. And as we've heard, there are bumps along the way in any negotiation, and we're going to encounter more, no doubt. But I think some of the, let me say where I think there are three things that are really quite radical departures from the start, and where things, I think these are things that are going to stay. The first is that this is the first time that an MNE group has been treated as one entity. And it stems from that. Once you start looking at an MNE group as an entity, you really have no choice but to look at the global consolidated profits of MNEs. And for the first time, the proposal is that a formula would divide these up on a global basis. So that's the second point. And then a third radical departure from the past is in amount B, the fixed return for routine distribution functions. And this is particularly significant, we are told, by low-income countries, the countries that struggle most with the standard transfer pricing requirements see this as one of the most important things. So I think these are the fundamental departures from the past, and I think these are the essence of the proposals on the table. They've borrowed greatly from what Mary Lou has talked about. We are negotiating, as I speak, with the steering group of the inclusive framework to seek an agreement on the broad direction of travel. And the fact that these countries are very much in full negotiation mode probably tells you that they are still all totally committed to addressing the significant problem of unilateral measures and believe that something must be done to counter this with some urgency. So that process remains on track. What we're hoping for is a kind of direction of travel agreement by January, and that will form the basis for a fuller agreement at a political level in 2020. But clearly, these reforms are huge, and as Mary Lou says, developing countries do, of course, struggle with keeping up with the pace of negotiations. And there will be work beyond 2020 on implementation, no doubt. So that's the first set of points I was going to say. The second is about process. The G20 and others have called for far greater inclusion, and Marilu has pointed out the need for maximum inclusion. We're doing our bit to make sure that the process is as inclusive as possible. We've got the majority of developing countries in our process now in the inclusive framework, a very strong leadership group, which includes some low-income countries. But we understand that they need help not just in implementation of the existing BEPS rules, but also in support of understanding the rule creation process and the ongoing support that's needed to help particularly low capacity countries in that endeavour. So everything that Marilu has said, I completely agree with. There are a whole range of issues which developing countries have said they are concerned about and want further detail on. And maybe we could come to those in the second term. But in summary, we're on track heading for what we hope is the beginning of a political agreement in early 2020. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben, for that intervention there. Now I'm going to turn to Maren. What are your thoughts about where discussions are going and what's happening?
Thanks, Stephanie. And first of all, it's great to be here. Virtual conferences, they're great, not just for the carbon footprint, but just also in terms of time and getting people together is so much easier than if it has to be face-to-face. There's a place for that, but there's certainly a place for this as well. First of all, it's a bit of a strange question to look ahead for, the next month. Lots of stuff is already put in place. It's not clear that there's all that much room for maneuver. And if you ask me for an evaluation whether we're going to be somewhere in early 2020 or it will all fall apart, I don't know. And Ben is in a better position to answer that one. I think there's a way of twisting your question a bit so that I can give a better answer. So first of all, what will an agreement early next year, what will it mean for developing countries, right? And there lots of things have been discussed already about what matters to developing countries. And I think the level of detail that will be available early next year, as opposed to things that still need to be worked out, and the process for working them out. Are they going to be left to countries, to groups of countries? Are they going to be, Marilu earlier mentioned the platform for collaboration on tax. Is there a role for the platform to develop guidelines on things that are put at a more general level in the inclusive framework consensus? So I think there's a lot of things that will need to be looked at, and my guess is that a lot of these details will not be clarified. There will be a relatively high level agreement. And for example, that for developing countries, what really matters is then what's going to be filled in on information that's available to them in working this new system. Can they require multinationals to make certain information available, country by country reporting, etc., local filings? That there's huge issues in that. The scope for simplified mechanistic rules, the fixed margin method is really appealing, I think, for developing countries. Now, how tight is that going to be drawn, or how much room for maneuver will there be? And then I think as has been said before in the sessions or in previous sessions, the Pillar 2 may actually be for developing countries even more important than Pillar 1. And I think there is a lot of detail to be left open in how far withholding can be applied to, what the room for countries will be. The other, and this really goes into two specific points. So one is, and Ben referred to it already a little bit, what is going to be what I call the second bite at the apple, right? I mean, January may be a first bite at the apple, and then we're going to have a process that will start from then where things are going to be further determined. So what is that process going to look like, and what's going to be on the table? I think that's really important. The other part is on how much scope will there be for unilateral measures. So let me turn it the other way around. Our assumption has been that an agreement in the inclusive framework will make countries think twice about continuing with things like a digital services tax. And how far is that really going to happen, right? Is the consensus going to be enough for countries to pull back on that? And at this point, we don't know, and we'll have to see. But there are other things as well. There's, for example, a paper that we did, Jan Luprik and Jonathan Pemberton. They did a paper on the diverted profit rule, right? Which gives developing countries, if you were to apply that, you can apply it unilaterally, and it would give developing countries much more of a lever to push taxing rights to them. Now, is that something that countries will consider, right? It's not so much a proposal as it's just something that countries will think about, because it's something they can do, and what they can do, they will think about. So the issue is how much scope is there going to remain, and how much will the consensus crowd out in terms of unilateral measures that countries are considering or will considering if they don't like enough what's on the table. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Maren. Actually finished early. Thank you so much. And Vicky, I wanted to get your opinion about where discussions are going, challenges ahead in 2020. Floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Mary Lou. Stephanie, sorry. First off, just thanks to Alex and Tax Justice for inviting us and me to be part of this virtual conference, which is really pretty cool. And certainly incredibly important topic. I'll start out with the boring notion that I pretty much agree with most of what's been said so far in our session from Mary Lou and through my colleagues. There are an awful lot of weeds, let alone trees, that have to be sorted through in the complexities of both pillars of the inclusive framework proposals. But on the positive side, I think it's really important, as others have said, not to let that cause us to lose sight of the forest for the weeds and the trees. Unbelievably, almost, there's something perhaps approaching multilateral agreement, or at least there's serious discussion of moving away from the arm's length method, at least to some extent, and partly toward a formulary apportionment approach based on unified accounts of some kind. And there seems to be general agreement that some taxing rights should be allocated based on the location of sales. And on the other hand, looking at Pillar 2 and now what we call the globe approach, which isn't the main subject of this conference, but I think is incredibly important. There's serious discussion of broad adoption of some international concept of minimum taxation. And I think all those things are really quite revolutionary. So that's the good news. What's the less good news? We've already heard comments on a lot of this. Complexity. It's very hard to look at details of the unified approach as presently laid out and see simplification. I think pretty much everybody agrees with that. Layering the RPA and formula apportionment on top of the arm's length method is not a recipe for simplification. That may be something that the big countries and their multinationals want, but it's going to be quite complicated for the lower income and developing countries, as has been just discussed. Lack of detail, even though it's already super complicated. Would it be possible to reach meaningful agreement, even on the direction of travel, if there isn't more understanding of how this is going to work in practice? And as Mary Lou was saying, what the quantitative impacts will be, which is hard to work out until there's more details, of course. Mary Lou also pointed out that early estimates are that there really be minimal actual change, at least for the developing countries, in terms of impact at this point. And again, for us at the IMF, and as Marijn was saying, certainly for us, low-income countries are one of the primary concerns in this whole process. It may not necessarily be a bad thing that there might be minimal change in the tax base for those countries, at least if they, as is proposed, hang on to the retention of natural resource businesses, for example, in their tax bases, production on that side. But it does seem as if the residual profit idea should be coupled with some sort of meaningful simplification for those countries. And as has already been mentioned, I think what we're fondly referring to as amount B of Pillar 1, that is a fixed return on the normal profits, could be really important for that. I totally agree with Ben there. It's especially important for the low-income countries. And then also, as I was saying at the beginning, really important for the low-income countries, I think, personally, is minimum taxation, especially with regard to inbound FDI. This is likely far more important for them than the, at least as it's presently written, the adoption of the residual profit approach on a what's really a fairly minimal part of overall corporate profits. But one fears, because there's so much interest in Pillar 1 in part, that Pillar 2, that is the globe work, might be getting somewhat short shrift relative to the unified approach. And even more, within that, I think there's a bit of signaling, and Ben may want to speak to this, that minimum taxes on inbound could fall by the wayside as compared to minimum taxes on outbound, which is, of course, a bigger concern for the major economies. But simple minimum taxes on inbound investment, as I think Marijn was saying or alluding to, could mean the most, both quantitatively and in terms of simplification for the low-income countries. So just to wind up, what will happen? Who can tell? And certainly I can't. There does seem to be some general feeling out there, including among businesses, that at the present pace, achieving meaningful change that's sufficiently worked out and agreed on could be impossible. And that makes me worry personally, just myself, not speaking for the IMF, that we might lose what's really a rare, not to say unique opportunity to actually change the global architecture in a meaningful way in the interest of declaring the war won. So maybe it would be better to slug along for longer. On the other hand, as we all know, and I'm sure this is why there's a hurry to do that, to institute more delay isn't without political risk, that is the risk of ultimate failure. So it's a balancing act. But in conclusion, I think it's very, very heartening that there's a forum, that the G24 is so involved, that there's a forum for lower income and developing countries now, to the extent they're able to be heard. And I know that Ben and his colleagues are working quite hard to try to make their participation meaningful, and we too are involved in trying to do that. And my colleagues are also involved in, I think Mary Lou alluded to the need to help with impact assessment for those countries. And I mean, that is something we're trying to help with in conjunction with our technical colleagues at the OECD. So I think all those things are in process. I think it's incredibly exciting. And I think we do just need to keep our eye on the ball of impact on low-income countries and overall excessive complexity. So I'll stop there. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Now, Sol, your thoughts about what's been said previously here and in general. Where do you see things going in the state of play?
Yes, thanks very much, Stephanie, and thanks everybody. I'm a bit hoarse, having just got back from overnight from the South Centre conference in Delhi. But just briefly, I mean, where we're in agreement, I think, is that we are now having the right conversation. I think the big step forward, and due in no small part to the input from G24, is that now the proposal is to start from the correct starting place, which is to look at the global profits of M&Es, and to look for simplified formulaic approaches for allocating the profit. Now, finally, we're having the correct conversation because that was inherent in the mandate from the G20 for the BEPS project way back in 2013 to tax multinationals where economic activities take place and value is created. That really cannot be done through the way in which the so-called arm's length principle has been interpreted. It's impossible to properly attribute the profits if you start from the separate parts. And I think a major reason for this is that the major achievement in the BEPS project in the first phase was country-by-country reporting. Countries now do have the overview that country-by-country reporting gives them, which now I think finally makes possible not only some of the economic impact assessments we've been seeing, but also a consideration of how far that aim of allocating the profits where activities take place and value is created, how that can be done. So we're having the correct conversation. Now, having said that, the specific proposal in unified approach, I think clearly cannot work. I mean, for a number of reasons, not only the complexity of the residual profit allocation, but also that it would apply apparently only where the new taxable nexus exists. And for both the new taxable nexus and the new formulaic approach, treaties would need to be changed. So it would only apply if all the countries involved change all their existing tax treaties. Now, this goes far beyond what was done through the multilateral instrument. This would require simultaneous amendment by countries of their tax treaties. Now, that's not going to happen, not only anytime soon, but ever, I don't think. So I think we really have to reconsider if we are moving to simplified, and I think we do need to move to simplified formulaic approaches for allocating the global profits of M&Es, we really need to think what the aims of the system are. And I think correctly looked at, the actual tax treaty rules have been misinterpreted and misapplied in the way in which transfer pricing has developed. The transfer pricing guidelines attempt to do this by looking at transactions between the different entities. But evidence is that that does not result in what we might call arm's length outcomes. The tax treaty rules really aim at ensuring that the affiliates of a multinational within a jurisdiction are taxed similarly to that of comparable independent firms. That's, I think, essentially what Articles 7 and 9 in tax treaties say. And there's considerable evidence that that does not happen. The evidence of avoidance by multinationals is looking at how much they don't pay, but there has been now some studies of comparing what they do pay with what independent firms pay. And in particular, I will point to a very important study, I think, recently published in the American Economic Review based on actual tax return data from the UK HMRC over 14 years. And that showed that over those 14 years, on average, foreign affiliates of local affiliates of foreign multinationals paid half the effective tax rate of similar local companies. Now, that is not the intention of existing tax rules. So I think these formulaic approaches must be reconsidered also from that point of view, because I think that that opens up the conversation we should be having, which is how to shift away from this transactional focus in the existing transfer pricing rules to get rules which will actually produce these arm's length outcomes, similar taxation, and how far that can be done without requiring all tax treaties to be changed. And I think there, very significantly, the Indian government has proposed to introduce, in relation to attribution of profits to existing permanent establishments, but also to the significant economic presence, a formulaic approach, which is allowed in paragraph 7 of paragraph 4 of Article 7, rather, of the United Nations Tax Treaty Model. Now, I would argue, and we argue from the BEPS Monitoring Group, that also Article 9, if properly understood, also requires these arm's length outcomes, similar levels of taxation, and that formulaic approaches can achieve this. So I think we do have to start looking. We're having the correct conversation, but I think we need to look at how that approach can be used really to actually reform the tax rules and not simply patch up or attempt to patch up a single part of them, and to do so in a way which will actually be impossible to achieve if it requires changes to all tax treaties. Okay, that's my first contribution.
Thanks so much, Saul. As we can all tell, there are lots of outstanding issues and concerns that need to be addressed in a very short time period. So I'm going to just ask a couple follow-up questions just to everybody, no one in particular really. So speaking of the time frame and, the politics behind that drives this process along, as you all know, the United States recently threw the wrench into this conversation, and so it called for Pillar 1 to be basically essentially an optional approach for multinationals, calling it a safe harbor regime. What are your thoughts about what this means for the immediate future of the conversation? I know, Ben, you said that the conversation is still on track, but how does everyone else think about this development?
You want us to just to raise our hands on this one?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. That's make a conversation. Yep.
So just my two bits, and this is not something not necessarily a bank position, but just looking at things as I see the news come in. It seems like a very substantial wrench in the works, and I don't want to kind of second guess what Ben is saying about things are on track. I'm sure he's right. But thinking through what just the proposal means, whether or not there's still a lot of room for negotiation, I think a safe harbor regime for Pillar 1 essentially makes Pillar 1 toothless. It won't really work in practice. That would be my guess. The other thing is that it seems, you could think about it in terms of, well, the US is doing this all the time. They participate in global discussions in the tax area, also in some other areas, anti-money laundering, etc. And then they don't adopt the outcome, but they often open the discussion in the first place by having introduced something that then becomes part of an international discussion. The international discussion ends at a somewhat different point, and they say, we'll still stick to our old thing, right? And for this discussion, you can have a similar view. I think here the comparison is not complete, because it's very hard to see Pillar 1 function with even if all the other countries say yes, we adopt the consensus as it now seems to be emerging. If US then says we're opting out, we need this to be a safe harbor regime, then it's very hard to see it function in reality. So I think in that sense, it's a very big wrench. And I hope that what Ben is implying is that there is a discussion between the US and in the context of the IF where, there's serious discussion about whether their proposal is sensible. Otherwise, I find it very difficult to see a good outcome.
Ben, you would like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to this other than to say clearly what our Secretary General has asked of the US for is an urgent meeting and some kind of explanation. So we are obviously concerned with trying to understand the US position. But such is the pressure for all countries to deal with the problems of retaliation through tariffs and trade and unilateral measures. I've just come from a room where the steering group of the inclusive framework is doing just that, trying to understand the US position. But everybody is here to negotiate. Nobody is walking away, and I think that is the overwhelming. Actually, it's the overwhelming message that came from the US in response to the French suggestion that the US was walking away from multilateral negotiations. That's why they wrote with such urgency to say that they are not, but what they've come back with clearly needs urgent explanation. And the countries who are all very concerned with unilateral measures are negotiating that right now. And by the time I get back, I'll have probably missed the key discussion. But yes, it is live, this issue, and countries are talking about it. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Thank you.
Anyone else? Or Mary Lou, well, from your perspective, what do you think, and what do you make of all this, the direction of travel, and prospects, just taking into account this development?
I mean, I'm informed by that. I was just at the G20 deputies, and so and Ben is correct. At least the posture I saw was they're not a clear message that the U.S. is engaged and wants to pursue the same timeline, but they still are discussing the within domestically in the Treasury, they're discussing the potential impact of the safe harbor proposal. So the discussions are still going on, and at least from developing countries, at least the opinions that were aired was that was not to lose this opportunity for change, and that's probably one of the most important concerns right now, because as people said, really important, fairly radical departures from the past are being discussed, and that window may not be there forever. So and so that's the concern of despite all the concerns about about complexity and everything else, losing that opportunity for change is probably one of the most important concerns right now.
And how? Oh, sorry, Vicky. Yes. So, what would you?
Just to say, and I think I said before, I guess I certainly agree with Mary Lou on that, and we don't want to lose this opportunity to make some important changes that would bring the tax system more in line with reality than the one that was developed 100 years ago. I detect, I think, from both Marijn, certainly, and implicitly from Ben, that, and again, speaking for myself, not the IMF as an institution, it does seem that trying to make this part of Pillar 1 into a safe harbor is basically almost to say this can't work. But I'm very heartened by what Ben said to hear that, negotiations are ongoing. And I think, as Mary Lou was saying, that in itself is really, really important. But I just don't see how a safe harbor approach is going to work. Never mind whose ox is being gored. It just as a practical matter.
Sol, I understand you wanted to weigh in.
Yes, I'm afraid I have a rather different view. The US reaction, I think, was entirely understandable because the discussion, I think, of Pillar 1 showed that the existing approach would not work as a generalized approach. It is not a generalized approach. It just does not work to apply a one-size-fits-all split to decide how much goes to market jurisdictions. It will not work to try and define consumer facing and require businesses to segment their accounts. It just would not work. So what might come out of the US approach would be, in a sense, the approach that we've advocated, which is that you agree on general principles and then you apply them in a bottom-up way on you could do it through advanced pricing agreements, which would be individual to companies. So this would not necessarily be, the company opting into an existing system, but the relevant countries agreeing an advanced pricing agreement for the companies which are causing the most problems at the moment. But we would say that should be part of the more general approach. If you now do want to start talking about fractional apportionment approaches, simple methods starting from global profits, You could do that by agreeing at the political level that we're going for these kinds of fractional apportionment approaches, and then developing in a pragmatic way how you apply that. I think not company by company, but preferably according to different business models and industry sectors. So that's, I think, the way forward, rather than attempt to impose a one-size-fits-all system of just trying to decide percentages that somehow apply across the board for defining routine, non-routine, and then amazingly retaining the existing transactional approach to transfer pricing to allocate what would be the bulk of the profit. Bear in mind the existing unified approach for amount C, which would be 85% of the profit, would retain the transactional approach, which does not make sense.
Thank you for that.
Stephanie, you accidentally muted yourself.
Oops, sorry, Maren. Sorry about that. Maren, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't dispute actually anything that Sol is saying. I think it's a very valid viewpoint on this, and I really appreciate that line of thinking. I do, what I'm a bit, I take the perspective of developing countries. What I do worry about is that if that is the outcome of this, that lots of countries will say, and that's why we negotiated for so long, it won't really mean very much for us, right? I can see it from the US context clearly, but I think I would then fear for a further march in the direction of unilateralism in this space. And now, would that be completely horrible? No, I can imagine a way in which unilateralism is considered in a way that still is constructive, right? Like I said before, in my main points, is the trade-off between unilateralism and multilateralism is still on the table, is not gone. So I think there's a way of thinking about it, but it would completely change the course of the discussion if this goes through. Not saying it's necessarily completely for the worse, but there would be a disruption effect of it.
Well, there perhaps I don't agree, in that I think this is the way the discussion has to go. Once you put on the table that you're allocating formulaically and in a simple way, which essentially is what developing countries want and need. It was not only developing countries, but Mr. McDonald from Procter & Gamble, who pointed out that half of the members of the inclusive framework, that's ought to say virtually all developing countries, cannot apply the existing transfer pricing methods. They do not have a transfer pricing economist. They've got to have formulaic methods. So you could, for example, work on the amount B proposal and develop other forms of amounts B for not only distribution, but other common systems. But I think you should work on easy to apply formulaic approaches in the areas that affect developing countries.
So maybe we do agree. Yes.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your thoughts on that question. I'm sorry I sort of lobbed that in there. But I think we're running a little bit, over, so I might just go straight to Q&A. We've got some questions for you all, actually. I'm going to move backwards. First, okay, so we got a question here from Nessa Ni Chesaid. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. Question is, can the panelists indicate if there is any discernible common strategy coming from the tax havens in the negotiations? Anybody can just jump in.
Sorry, you have to repeat that, Stephanie.
Sorry. Is there any common strategy coming from tax havens in the negotiations, or what are the tax havens thinking about in all of this? Obviously, most of them will be losers. So, yes, Vicky.
Well, first off, just to say, we don't really refer to countries as tax havens, but I guess what's meant is sort of the low tax jurisdictions. And Ben can speak to what these member countries are saying. but it seemed pretty clear from what I saw in terms of preliminary impact analysis that indeed, if the tax base is reallocated pretty much in any manner, formulaic or with the RPA that's being proposed, that those indeed, the lower tax jurisdictions are the jurisdictions that most likely will lose tax base. It seemed as if there was not a whole lot of reallocation toward low-income countries in general, but perhaps away from low tax jurisdictions. So I would be interested to hear what Ben has to say about what's going on there.
Well, I know Saul had an intervention, I guess, because Vicky, you asked Ben a question. Ben, maybe you respond to that, please.
Yeah, I think the key issue is Pillar 2. It's Pillar 2 that will affect the low tax jurisdictions. If we can get an effective design, especially as Pillar 2 does not need all countries to change their tax treaties. It can be introduced by countries that are willing to do so. So an effective Pillar 2 is crucial. And an effective Pillar 2 also means moving away from what seems to be the approach at the moment to prioritize the income inclusion and residence countries. Pillar 2 has to be directed at the low tax jurisdiction. At the moment, the way it's designed, it seems to be designed to try and prevent source countries from offering tax incentives. And that should not be the purpose. Pillar 2 should be designed at preventing preferential tax regimes and low tax regimes.
I agree with much of what you say there, Sol. And going back to what Vicky said, there's this sense that much of the attention is on Pillar 1, particularly Amount A, because it's the exciting new formulaic approach. But I think a lot of developing countries are potentially very excited by Pillar 2. I think one of the reasons why they might be nervous about it is because they're worried about the rate differences that will end up between jurisdictions and whether these will be small enough to stop profit shifting. So there's lots of uncertainty about that, and I think as we go forward, there'll be much more consultations on Pillar 2. I think we've done 15 consultative meetings involving developing countries in the last 6 months, and there hasn't been enough emphasis on Pillar 2, partly because the proposals have not been as advanced. But I think they are developing countries are potentially very excited by that. We don't see in the negotiations any block positions by any groups of jurisdictions, however you might define them. And that's one of the challenges and opportunities of the current international negotiations, is that countries are not negotiating in blocks because their needs are so diverse and different. But just going back to a related point about revenues, I think there are significant revenues for countries that are basically poor, and a few $100 million of reallocation to small African countries is significant. So I think where we stand now is one of the reasons why countries are not yet in a position to expose their hand, is that we're only halfway through explaining potential models of economic impact. And as Mary-Lou said, the fund is doing work on that. We're doing work on that, and we're sharing results with all jurisdictions now. And so the next phase countries will be far better informed they'll have a better understanding of the potential revenue gains from both of these proposals.
Thanks very much for that. So just speaking about Pillar 2, we have a question here for Mary-Lou from Christoph Trottvetter. Does the G24 have a position on Pillar 2? I have not found any comment in the OECD consultation from the G24. Why not?
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. Yeah, indeed, we haven't commented, and it's primarily what others have said, which is that it required the position is that we really do need to know more about it. And so given the time constraint of the consultations, we just didn't feel comfortable. At least a number of our members did not feel comfortable that they could articulate a really, how to say, a constructive position. There is support for sure, because this is where the low-income countries would benefit quite a lot if done well. But there are a number of perspectives that we need to iron out. One is what will happen to tax incentives and the sovereign's right to continue with some of the tax incentives. We have been associated with that, but actually that's only one part of the discussions among our members. The other, and I think the more dominant part, is just a better understanding of it. And so as more information comes around on Pillar 2, we would, I think, be able to have at least a range of views that we can articulate better.
Thanks so much. One other question from Eric Faring. Recognizing the need for speed, but also the need for fair and transparent solutions to global taxing rights, how inclusive must the inclusive framework be to be inclusive enough? Any thoughts? I guess Mary Lou, since we have you there.
Well, I think a sense of fairness from the perspective of countries would go a long way towards perceiving that this is truly an inclusive framework. There is a lot of goodwill in this. I mean, whatever the comments are, we can disagree in views, but there is a lot of goodwill in making this work. So I gather ultimately at the end of it is a sense of perception of fairness and equity. And that would go a long way towards giving the feeling that this is truly inclusive.
Anyone else would
perhaps a comment. I think the key question is how you make the contribution of developing countries effective. It is essential because, frankly speaking, it's the OECD countries that have designed the rules that have now been found ineffective. And you really need a perspective of source countries, because after all, taxing where activities take place means in source countries where the business activities take place. And consistently, we've seen that OECD countries look at it from the perspective of residence countries. Again, I come back to Pillar 2. Pillar 2 seems to be being designed from the perspective of the residence country, and that's the wrong perspective. If you're trying to safeguard taxation where the activities take place, it should be to protect the source country. And so the developing countries have been reacting to the way it's been formulated, and the discussion document talked about the need to put a brake on incentives for inbound investment. The real issue isn't that. The real issue is how to allow a source country to ensure that space is not eroded, and to accept, for example, credit for withholding taxes from source countries which are levied in order to stop base erosion from the source country. So unless we get that perspective from source countries, which developing countries are, we will never get an adequate solution, and it needs an effective solution.
Vicki, you wanted to weigh in? Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say I completely agree with Saul in regard to Pillar 2 needs to focus much more than seems to so far vaguely be the case on, it needs to focus on the source countries and protecting their base, not so much from the perspective only of the residence countries. I would, though, just to make it more interesting, I guess, differ somewhat with Mary Lou and Saul on the notion that we have to make sure to protect the source countries, the low-income source countries' rights to grant tax incentives. I think one of the valuable things that would come out of the outbound, the residence-based minimum tax, is perhaps to reduce the incentives that those countries now very legitimately, it's true, they very legitimately face these huge incentives to compete with each other by granting what we would call tax expenditures. And therefore, voluntarily, in a sense, reduce their own tax bases. The good part from our standpoint, like one of the best parts of the residents' side of Pillar 2, is that if implemented appropriately and pretty comprehensively, it would serve to reduce the incentives for those countries face to feel forced to engage in that behavior, and thus safeguard a lot of their tax base without undermining their ability to compete for investment as much.
Can I bring in a final thing, Stephanie? Is that okay?
Sure, yes.
Okay. So I cannot agree more with all these things that have been said, and including Vicky's last point about the importance also of the income inclusion aspects for competition, for tax competition. And one way to maybe boil it down is that both elements, both the base eroding payments that really help you with the source country rights, and the income inclusion, which helps you with the minimum tax and the tax competition part. They both need to be part of it, and the ordering is really important, right? And for developing countries, and you want to order it so that the base eroding payments that protect the source countries, that comes first, and that doesn't seem maybe perhaps where we're heading. So that's one. I want to make one final brief point on this, and this is when we talk about inclusiveness, we tend to see countries as monolithic, and as long as they're at the table and they send a representative, and the representative is heard and is nicely informed, is well informed, then you have inclusivity. I don't think that's quite true, right? This is a highly technical discussion. I personally have a lot of trouble keeping up with the technical aspects of it. And every time somebody like Saul speaks, I learn. So there's like, it is too hard for people to understand what it actually means. And there's numbers floating around, and Alex, I hope he's nodding now in the background. I can't see him. The numbers floating around, which are very important to people. But I think the connection between those kind of narratives and figures, and the way that it's there he is, and the way that it is talked about is still very disjoint from the discussions that happen in the inclusive framework. So we have more of an inclusivity issue than just are the right countries at the table and are sending representatives who know what they're talking about. They also need to be the representatives in the governments who can work this at home, and civil society, etc., need to help with this as well. So I think sometimes we're banging a bit on the wrong drum on this.
I completely agree with that, Marijn, that massive effort needs to be made outside of the committee process and working parties, and there's a big pressure on us, but also on the Platform for Collaboration on Tax Partners to do more work to prepare developing countries for these types of negotiations, and on a very large capacity agenda. I agree with that.
I might also add the conversation should also include, journalists. I mean, this is a conversation that was started through the media. I mean, by the media. I mean, with all the pressure that we've put on, well, not me, but mainstream media has put on corporations, which kind of got the BEPS project going. So, it's also important, I think, to to educate journalists. I mean, I learned so much just by being here with you all. So, and I've been covering this stuff for 8 years. So I really appreciate the time that you guys take to explain these concepts and participate in these public discussions. So I guess one other question, I mean, I guess we could just, one question I actually had about the future of the inclusive framework. Well, it was supposed to be just for remaining standard setting for the BEPS project, but now we've got this dynamic where so many countries are involved in a lot of ways. And, is that going to be an indication of where tax policy will head in the future? Now that countries are all involved in this, like what's next after, once after this is all sorted out? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So you assume it will be sorted out? So,
Well,
so I think one answer is, and that was as part of my earlier remarks, is that I think we're likely going to go into a situation where some issues continue to be discussed. You know, and our work plan will be put together with a continuing discussion about some of these elements. I don't think 2020 will be the end of this, or should be the end of this. I think the discussion needs to continue.
Vicky, yes.
I'd certainly agree with that. I think in a way what you're asking is, can you put the genie back in the bottle? And I hope, at least, I think the answer to that is probably no, as Marijn was just saying, and nor should we. I think that the inclusive framework represents, flawed as it might be, as people have been suggesting, I think it actually represents a huge leap forward. And I think, you know, in part that's to the credit of Ben and his colleagues who have really tried hard to support the countries with less capacity in this area. And we all need, as international institutions, we all need to keep doing that. And I think, this is me personally speaking again, not the IMF. I think actually it may transpire that trying to bring much more inclusivity into the existing setup, which is really what this is doing, maybe that's been the most promising and important way forward to get more inclusivity. It's not perfect, but I'm not sure it could be perfect given the vast discrepancy between, you know, the world's largest economy and tiny countries with very few highly technically trained people that have any time to spare to think about this stuff.
Right. I mean, I find it unthinkable that an OECD process to discuss taxation would ever go back to the narrow set of OECD member countries. And whoever said it, the genie is out of the bottle. I think that's completely right. And once you have the allocation of taxing rights on the table, then there is no turning back. And I would see the process continuing despite the lumps and bumps on the way. And there'll be more calls for inclusion, and there'll be more calls to address the specific concerns of low income and other developing countries. I think that's just inevitable.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to maybe wrap up. I think we're nearing the end here for our conversation. Thank you again for your contributions and for teaching me about all these concepts, and I've learned a lot in this past hour or so. Going back to journalism, you know, we journalists like to end our stories with what we call a kicker quote. Some pithy observation from a source that either summarizes the news or points to the future. What would be your kicker quote as this work progresses in 2020? Let's start with, I'm going to start with Ben.
The genie is out of the bottle. That's where I would end it. No turning back.
I guess, Vicky, I'll go with you.
Well, I think that would basically be my summary, that I think what we're seeing is if I can use a tired analogy, the birth pangs of something actually quite dramatic, both on the front of how are we going to allocate taxing rights? Are we, the world, going to take the position that there should be some level of minimum tax paid under current circumstances? And finally, who's going to decide these things? All three of those things have radically changed, and I think that's all to the good. And even if it takes a long time to get somewhere workable, I think it's quite amazing.
So let me ask you what you think.
My kicker quote would be from Grace Perez Navarro at the end of the first day of the consultation on Pillar 1, when she said, in response to people who'd said that we shouldn't forget all the good work done on the transfer pricing guidelines. And she said they reminded her of the John Lennon song, "Give Arm's Length a Chance." She said, no, we're not doing that. he effectively said the arm's length principle is dead. She said, we are working on fractional methods.
You're muted.
Mary Lou, sorry, I have a problem. I can't press buttons today. Mary Lou, what would you think?
Well, I mean, this is a heartening closing. And the only thing I can think about is that we are all for no turning back. It's
absolutely. Maureen?
I would say, especially after all of these kicker quotes, I would say get back to work. I guess we know what I mean by that, so I don't need to explain.
Well, thank you again for your fabulous contributions and really great conversation. I really had fun today, so I hope all of you had fun as well. And all of you watching at home, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it back to Alex.
Great, thank you, Stephanie, for moderating that so well and even to time. So you are very many points ahead of me. But no, that's really great. And kicker quotes, I will remember that as a wrapping up tool. And thank you all. We really appreciate that. I'm struck by the extent of consensus that I think has emerged broadly over the course of the day. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to summarise what I think the key points that we've got to are before closing. So firstly, and I don't think this was contested beforehand, but still important, the global distribution of taxing rights is unjust and deeply so. Far too much profit ends up in low or no tax jurisdictions rather than where the real economic activity takes place. And the revenue implications of that, although uncertain, are very definitely substantial. I think from the panel discussion this morning or earlier, what came out quite clearly, unfortunately, is that we do not yet have a combination of data and methodology that generate comprehensive results on the redistribution of taxing rights that different proposals would lead to. And on that, one important point that we didn't touch on, 2020, next year, we'll see a review of the OECD country-by-country reporting standard. And that's just a perfectly timed opportunity to try and sort out the technical basis of the data we've got. We heard David Bradbury highlighting the weaknesses of that data, the need at the moment for it to be coupled with other things and treated with caution. The just published country-by-country reporting standard from the Global Reporting Initiative provides a much more solid technical basis. And I very much hope we'll see the OECD standard converge towards that basis, as well as eventually becoming public. Of course, we need good data and we need it to be public. On the question of public, while we've been talking today, a vote in the Austrian Parliament has called for the government to support public country-by-country reporting at the European Union level. And that might be enough to swing the balance of European Union members towards majority. And of course, if the EU goes with publishing the OECD standard for country-by-country data, that pretty much will cover most of the world's country-by-country reporting. We'll suddenly have a full data set that can really start answering these questions as long as we get the technical basis right. The third point of consensus, coming back to the panel we've just had, I think it was this. The inclusive framework has been a real step forward. It is a real step forward. But, and there is a kind of very significant but there, the distribution of political rights over international tax reform is probably, if anything, even more unjust than the distribution of taxing rights. I think it sounds like it remains an open question whether the OECD process can evolve to give non-OECD members a genuinely equal say. And if not, it's hard to see how this process ultimately can deliver an acceptable deal that addresses the distribution of taxing rights fully. So we might be left with a choice between an explosion of unilateral measures or perhaps a consensus to shift to UN forum. But those possibilities in themselves should give power to the OECD Secretariat to challenge OECD members for a more equal outcome here, because the alternative could well be worse. Finally, the point of consensus that we've just heard from the panel, it's very clear. There is no turning back. The genie of looking at the distribution of taxing rights and seeking a reduction in the global inequality is well and truly out of the bottle, as Ben and Marijn and Vicky in particular have said. And we can see the role of the G24, as Mary Lou laid it out, increasingly significant there in representing a group of lower income countries' voices in a powerful way and putting forward serious technical proposals that can't be ignored. So everything is open, but actually there's a surprising amount of consensus there. And I think, over the next year, we may see some of these questions really start to be answered. It seems perhaps unlikely to think that we might have a final outcome by the end of 2020, but we will continue down this road, and it feels like, despite a number of major roadblocks, the direction of travel is positive for the global distribution of taxing rights. Let me close by saying thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions, and it was in the audience, all the speakers for giving their time and for working with the technology that I think really worked very well. Again, to Stephanie for moderating that great session there. And to the Tax Justice Network team, who really made the conference possible and made the technology work so well in the background where technology should be. That includes Will Snell, Mark Boumansour, and especially Helena Rose, who really has been the driving force behind this. With that, I will say thank you all, and I look forward to being in touch with all of you as this work continues, and I hope eventually takes us to the right place. So thank you. And this material, I should say, will all be available, the slides, the video, and papers presented and data even on our site within the next day or two. And I hope people can use that as a reference point and also add more into the discussion as more work evolves.